is David Schnese Jacobson. I'm the preaching professor here at Boston University and also the director of the Homiletical Theology Project, which hosts these webinars with people interested in the place of theology and preaching and in practical theology generally. I am so pleased today to have my counterpart at Emory, Dr. Ted Smith, with us. He's Associate Professor of Preaching and Ethics at Candler School of Theology and author of this book, The New Measures, A Theological History of Democratic Practice. And let me say, Ted, I really loved reading your book, and so I'm excited to have you here today. What I'd like to do is to go around the room and have people introduce themselves so that you know who you're talking to. And then after that's done, I think we'll just turn it over to you, and you can feel free to talk a little bit about your understanding of your research, of what practical theology is, maybe a little bit about how interdisciplinarity enters your work, and any other thing you think would help us to understand this very unique project you set out in the New Measures and in the speech that you shared with us from Virginia. So anyway, one other frame about our time here is that in the last few weeks in practical theology class, we've been talking about theories of practice, which make up also some of the work that you're doing. But one of the things that we've encountered as well as trying to think interdisciplinarily about practical theology is the fact that you use history or tradition as a source for doing practical theology. So that'd be another piece I think we'd love to hear a little bit about from you today. I know how near and dear history is to your heart, so I don't think it'll be too much to get you to talk about that.
Yeah, it'd be good for me to have to.
Okay, all right. So let's, I'd like to start with Jada over here, who will introduce herself. We'll go around the room and everyone can tell who they are. Jada.
Hello, my name is Jada Gonzalez. I am a first-year PhD student here in practical theology.
My name is Mason Lee. I'm a STM student here, focusing in homiletics.
Hello, my name is Tuesday Lee. I'm second-year PhD in practical theology.
All right, great.
I'm Jonathan Rosmini. I'm a first-year PhD student in practical theology and spirituality.
Great.
And my name is Chris, and I am a Doctor of Ministry student and a UCC pastor.
All right, hi Chris.
All right, so we'll turn it over to you at this point, and once you've had a chance to talk for a few minutes about your program, maybe 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes, we'll then have an open dialogue with each other. But let me just welcome you and say how grateful I am you can be here today.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to get to connect with you all, and I'm looking forward to just talking these things through with you. But I also owe you a huge thanks for whatever reading you did in that book. It's a lot to read. So, thanks for the time that you put into it, and then with whatever else you've read, and the video or the script from Virginia on top of it. Thank you. I'm really honored by the time you've taken with this. One of the things I heard you asking me to do was to talk about my understanding of practical theology, and so I thought I might start there. I should confess I don't feel very well equipped to answer that question, in part because I've deliberately refused it many times. I'm concerned about all the energy that can sometimes go to the work of defining practical theology. I'm concerned about it because I think that it was especially in one seminar that I did that I loved. It was a mixture of pastors and academics, and the pastors could not have been less interested in the definition of practical theology. And what hit me in that is there's an interest in the doing of it or seeing it done well, but the work of defining what the discipline is, or whether it's a discipline or a field of inquiry or what its nature is, this is mostly an intra-academic conversation. And my worry is that it's an intra-academic conversation that betrays some of the great goods of practical theology done well, in that it instead of being interdisciplinary, it becomes the task of marking off a certain space and saying, this is our discipline. If you do this, you're us. If you don't, you're not. So it can lose the interdisciplinarity, and then I think it can also lose that more public vocation of practical theology. That its great gift is to pull academics beyond the academy. So the work of defining it as a discipline, or defining it as a guild or a field, I think it risks betraying both of those goods. So usually I just try to say, well, let's change the subject, or just do it. Let's just do some great stuff in practical theology, and then that'll be the best case to make. But I don't want to be a rude guest, so.
You might be pleased to know this the conversation we've had as well.
This is not like the preacher's hyperbole here, but it really is true. I've never in my life before offered a definition of practical theology. I've always tried to resist it. So, but I'm going to do one because I don't want to be a bad guest. But the key to it is, I think, it's more a description of one way to approach these inquiries that can kind of it tells you the way I think about what I do. I have very little interest, no interest in policing the boundaries of this or in making it a more normative model, and especially not an exclusive model. If you're not doing this, you're not doing practical theology. So it's not that kind of definition. But I would offer one like this. I think of my work, the center of my work is eschatological reflection on and for everyday practices of ministry. So just that little phrase, eschatological reflection on and for everyday practices of ministry. So each word there carries some weight to kind of go through them word by word. The eschatological there, you've seen it across the books or across the things you've read, I'm sure. But to me, what it's trying to capture is that now and not yet tension that I think is at the core of a Christian understanding of the world. And it's to try to imagine even the practices of ministry, even the sacraments, even proclamation of the gospel, as something that's only possible because of the redeeming work of God that's already happening right now, already has happened in Jesus, and yet is not yet fully realized. So to see these practices, whatever their telos is, if that language even makes sense, is a telos that's over the horizon. It's a telos that finds its fulfillment in a reality that it can't create. So to try to talk about now and not yet. And eschatological reflection, this is something that I've learned especially from my students as they have wrestled with their vocations. A lot of the doctoral students that I've worked with who have an interest in practical theology, when it comes down to it, what they really want to be is activists. But they're just really smart. And so everybody's always told them, hey, you should be an academic. They're like, well, is there a way I can be an academic and still kind of be an activist or a pastor or something? Maybe practical theology. But I say that is a great vocation and you should pursue it. But I think there is an academic vocation too, and the academic vocation is going to involve some moment of reflection. So practical theology might end in action, it might encourage action, it might reflect on action, but in the thing itself, I think it's a reflection. It's a moment of reflection. So eschatological reflections in that middle term, on and for. I think I'm most interested in practical theology that is really close to practices of ministry, broadly construed. So it's thinking about those practices of ministry, it's reflecting on them, but then the for there is important too, because we're not just kind of theologically inflected sociologists who reflect on these practices. There's some sense, I think, as a practical theologian, you assume responsibility with others for the health of these practices. So as somebody who's really interested in preaching, I want to write about sermons, I want to write about preaching, but I also want to do it in ways that strengthen preaching. So it's on and for the sake of that practice. So the next one, every day. I think there's a tendency sometimes when we think about practices of ministry to look at virtuosic practice, to look at the really great practitioners and kind of take it as normative. I think that you can learn a lot by looking at really great practitioners. I'm more interested in everyday, in widely shared practices. Like, that's what the New Measures is about. It's about Finney, but it's not really about Finney. It's really more about trying to work through Finney to get down into these practices that became very commonplace that almost every preacher does. Things like telling a story to illustrate a point. That's the kind of thing I'm most interested in. everyday practices. To use language of practice here, to me, is to stress especially the performed, embodied nature of the task. It's not ideas about preaching or something, it's the practice of it. So here's another of my biases, because I'm most interested in the practice there, the everyday practice of ministry. I'm often not as interested in, I hope this isn't heresy to say, I'm much more interested in preaching than I am in homiletics. I'm more interested in the practice of preaching and in what people are doing than in the second order discourse about preaching. I feel responsible to be engaged always with the second order discourse about preaching, but I really worry when that second order discourse about preaching starts to displace preaching as the subject matter at the beginning. So for instance, you sometimes see introductory classes in preaching that are really introductory classes in homiletics. We're going to pull you into the literature in homiletics. No, we need to pull them into deeper reflection. The other thing I think is that if you focus on preaching instead of homiletics, then you've got 20 centuries of brilliant minds through the preachers. And if you focus on homiletics, you really got 100 years or 150 of this modern, the way this field has coalesced. So it just expands the universe of conversation for us. All right, so eschatological reflection on and for everyday practices of ministry. And ministry here, I mean in an elastic sense. Not just things that ordained people do. If that was ever a distinction you could make, it's certainly not now. So to really stretch out a full sense of what gospel ministry is. So that's what I think I do. It's kind of my, it's the best description I have of what I do. Eschatological reflection on and for everyday practices of ministry. So, where does history come into that?
Yeah.
Why historical work? I should say, my own stuff is usually historical, and that's, but I don't see a big distinction between history and sociology on this, or history and ethnography. I see them broadly as descriptive disciplines and empirical disciplines that are trying to say what happened in some sense. And the main difference between history and the sociology in this case is when the thing happened. Then you use different methods, but the fundamental work of describing something is to me the same. And so I would want to gather up not just an interest in history, but an interest in history, sociology, ethnography, all the techniques that we would use to describe what's happened. And the main reason I do history, say, instead of ethnography, is because Brooks Holyfield was here at Emory when I was here. He's a superb historian, and we just really hit it off. So it could have gone either way. What I'm most interested in is the descriptive piece. So let me say why I'm interested in the descriptive side of it. And some of this material is narrated in a different way in the new measures. But I really do think the great realization of our age, meaning the last 30 or so years, is the cultural situatedness of all known. So to say that whatever you know from somewhere, that there is, in Thomas Nagel's language, that there is no view from nowhere. Every view is a view from somewhere, and that somewhere has some kind of cultural specificity. I think that is just an inescapable wall that we run into all the time, and it's also the great resource and engine for our work. So I went to and in its bad form, it's just sophomore relativism, but it's also this great thing that people have tried to wrestle with. And I think I went to college thinking that what I would try to find was a way to beat that, right? So I went into philosophy especially, and I thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some philosophy, and then we're going to get into really, what's really true or what's really good, not just what this group says or that group says about it. But every time I started going into these normative inquiries, I ended up coming out in history. So that was or in culture. So that was the case with the British empiricists. They terminate in Hume and in custom and convention. or 20th century British analytic philosophy, ends in Wittgenstein, and so forms of life. Well, if knowledge is rooted in these forms of life, you kind of back to culture. Or, so we'll try the continent, and you go through Kant though, but then Hegel's correction throws you into Sittlichkeit, and you're back into culture, you're back into history. So this happened for me again and again and again. And I think early in I'd say in my 20s, at reading Alistair McIntyre, it really helped to pull that together and to say, okay, here's a way that I can reclaim some sense of rationality. It doesn't end up in relativism, and it happens through an account of history and tradition. But and that's where the descriptive piece comes in, that these ideas are always going to be culturally located, so you have to do this cultural and descriptive work. But then my worry about McIntyre was that his notion of tradition sets up the authority for interpreting here in such a way that I worried that a tradition could go wrong if the masters of its guild got it wrong, like the American Southern Protestants before and after the Civil War. How do you correct within McIntyre's system? Or couldn't a whole culture go bad and it would still, it's still making sense within its language game, within its forms of reasoning, but it's just wrong. It's really off the rails and it has no way to correct itself. I think that same worry was the worry that drove the Frankfurt School. They were steeped in the historicism that was happening in Germany in the 20s, the kind of hangover from Hegelianism, but they're worried too about how a whole culture can go wrong. And then if you're a thoroughgoing historicist, how do you correct that? Because all you could call upon would be the resources of that culture. So that's where you get Benjamin's messianism or Adorno's negative dialectic. Both of those are ways that try to work from entirely immanent sources to something that transcends those immanent sources. So I don't always take content from Adorno and Benjamin, I more take a structure of thought. And to loop back around here, I think what they really give us is eschatological modes of thinking. It's an epistemology that is informed by a sense in which the truth is now, it is in this cultural form, but also not yet. It transcends it. So it's that turn to culture that leads me into history. And then it's my worries about how you need something transcending history. That's what gets me to, especially Benjamin and Adorno as the primary interlocutors. That was a lot to throw out there to get us started, but I'd like to, if there are other questions you want me to pursue, or if you want me to say more about any of that, I'm glad to do it.
I actually would like to.
The social cues over there.
That's okay. It's hard to see, isn't it? I think what I'd like to do, I do want to come back to a question of theories of practice again. But before we do that, I actually want to open it up to questions because we were just having a conversation about eschatology a minute before we started here. And I wonder if anyone has any questions they want to ask at this point.
So I brought up the topic of eschatology a little bit. I come from the Orthodox tradition, and that's a lot of what we're doing. And it's not necessarily a question, but maybe if you could respond to it. But the notion that not only the practices that we do, but our actual identity is something that's defined eschatologically. Who we are is who we are becoming, as opposed to necessarily just what we're doing. In terms of that eschatological reality. So what we're doing in history reflects a becoming of who we're supposed to be, so to speak, eschatologically.
Yeah, I would resonate strongly with that account. And it's in chapter 5 of the book that you have, of the new measures that I try to think most about anthropology and theological anthropology, and I'm thinking especially about the preacher, the preacher's self, and what happens to preachers' selves when they engage in kind of rhetoric of authenticity once you start presenting your private life. Or public legitimation, what happens. So I just wanted to say, yes, we absolutely need to think about the self eschatologically and not just actions. And for me, that's going to mean keeping both the now and the not yet. We're going to see these wounded bodies, these wounded selves, and not to paper over that in some narrative of progress or something, but to name a real disjunction.
Any other questions at this point, or should we? Well, I think I'd like to return to this question of theories of practice, in part because I know at some points you push back against McIntyre, and open up the question of the place of Bourdieu as well at one point in your, I think it's the Fugleman chapter, if I remember right. But I wanted you to talk a little bit more about your understanding of practice, because one of the things I find most fascinating about your work is the way you do theology as sort of a study of practices of history. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more about how you understand yourself in relation to that literature that McIntyre and Bourdieu represent, and then maybe identify the unique position of your own research trajectory.
Well, I don't know if it is unique, or even if I would hope that it is, but I'll try to talk about
All right.
it. But the McIntyre and Bourdieu, I think the main thing where I find McIntyre most helpful is in his insistence on historicizing practice, but more than practice, really, and this is stronger in who's which than it is in after virtue, but he's really historicizing rationality. And so what you can get with McIntyre is a turn to culture, a realization that all of knowledge is culturally situated. You get that without descending into a sort of relativism. And that, I think, is the great power and kind of enduring achievement of that. I absolutely want to carry that forward. And I think the other thing that is really important to carry forward and really useful to carry forward from McIntyre is the distinction between practices and institutions. See institutions as bearers of these practices, but to see practices as running beyond them and having purposes beyond them, I think that can be really helpful. So to see healing as a practice and a hospital as an institution, but what the terms do and the split does is let you name when an institution is out of sync with its practice and the ways in which exterior goods or external goods can kind of swamp the goods of the practice. I think those are really, really helpful analytic tools. So I want to keep all that. And then my two great worries about McIntyre are the one that I named, the way he conceives authority, I think, mean that if you're in that tradition, then you really don't have resources to correct the people who have authority in that tradition. His model of authority depends on masters of the guild, right? And and the master says whether it's not that the master can't be transcended, but the master would have to acknowledge that transcendence. So if the masters go off, if they're corrupt in the guild, or if they just don't know something, McIntyre isn't really troubled by that, because he says, well, what you do is then you just leave the tradition. But that's not always an option, I think. Or I think he's insufficiently attentive to how costly that can be. So for instance, around like ordination of gay and lesbian Christians, you can present something, the masters of the guild say no, and then McIntyre's solution would be, well, then you just leave that tradition. But that can be a really painful thing to do. People don't want it. You just leave the tradition. So I don't find that a satisfactory out. And I don't think he gives us the resources to think our way out of situations where the whole tradition has kind of gone bad or it's all missed something. So that's one of my main worries about McIntyre. My other main worry about McIntyre is that he conceives of traditions, as these bounded units that have a rationality that's entirely in themselves. And it just doesn't match up to the world as we live in it, And it creates what I think are artificial problems, because he just declares, these incommensurable culturally situated realities. And so then you've got the assumption that we're not going to be able to communicate with each other, the assumption that we're not going to be able to talk across these lines. But I think historically, we can talk about these things. We can move across these lines. So it's not good empirically, but it's also it creates all kinds of moral problems as well. Bourdieu, to me, is a really helpful corrective, especially on this latter count, because the habitus, the real power of the habitus as a descriptive tool is that it can trace the migrations of these kind of fairly solid little cultural units across different spheres of society. So that's what I try to do in the New Measures. Each chapter traces a practice across different things. So in some chapters, it's you can see preachers doing this, you can see politicians doing it, and you can see novelists doing it. You can see preachers doing it, you can see actors doing it, and you can, that kind of thing. The practice actually does migrate across these different spheres, and as it migrates, it retains, there's something to it. It retains some content. And that Bourdieu's concept of the habitus will help you spot that and then name it. In a way that McIntyre, his notion of practices as functioning only within traditions, you can't even see those kind of cross migrations, let alone help you think about them. So this is where I think Bourdieu is much better. And on the first one, that question of authority, I learned especially from Jeff Stout. And I think his Democracy and Tradition is kind of the great sifting of McIntyre, where he points at what's worth keeping, and then really goes at the authority question and says, this is what's not worth keeping. This creates a false dichotomy between tradition and democracy that we really need to just do away with. So McIntyre then corrected on the question of authority by Stout, and corrected on the question of the nature of multiple traditions or multiple spheres of society, corrected there by Bourdieu. That's the way I think about my own sort of work, at least as it was happening in the New Measures. Since the New Measures, I would say Soto has become much more important to me and Benjamin too. So, what's that mean for a unique place of my work? I think in both ethics and preaching, if there is, I don't know if it's, I wouldn't want to say it's unique, but I think a distinctive thing about it is the level of commitment to the historical research. I really want to, and this relates to the interdisciplinarity question. I am not a historian by training. I don't want to be a historian. I don't envy historians. I don't wish I were one or any of that. None of that. I'm so happy. I'm hopelessly normative and recklessly theological. Those are bad habits for historians. I want to keep those habits. So I don't want to be one. But I do want to do work that is of sufficient rigor and that kind of meets the standards of the Guild, that historians will say, no, the problem with this, like a Guild historian would say, the problem with this is not bad research, not that it's all secondary sources, it's all derivative. But they'll say, no, the problem with this is that you move from description, just staying on the empirical side of the line, you cross over that line. You're talking about the way God moves in the world. That's exact. And that's the fight I want to have, right? Not, this is crappy history, which I think a lot of times we can be written off for doing that, in both ethics and in preaching and in practical theology.
Browning has this idea that even at the descriptive phase, there's a way in which some of our theological normativity is already active. And I wondered how do you see that question?
I agree, absolutely. And I also want to, it's one of those, this I do fantasize about. An article that I would love to write would be an article about teasing out the latent pneumatologies of many landmark historical books in the last 20 or 30 years. And just say, let's just name the theology that's at work in book after book. Even David Hollinger's book, After Cloven Tongues of Fire, you know that, but it's a kind of narrative of liberal Protestantism giving itself over into the secular university. And you could say it's a triumphalist narrative of secularism, but it's a thoroughly theological work. On another hand, it's got an account of the good real, or some great good realizing itself in history. It's as thoroughly theological as any. So it's only to say, I think I think the historians are doing theology too. I just put my cards on the table. And kind of subject them to critique.
Yeah. Very good. Any questions?
Maybe a word on, or was somebody asking a question?
Not yet. Go ahead.
I think this is related to the question of descriptive studies broadly, whether it's history, sociology, or ethnography, and theology. I think this is a huge and very, very important and worthwhile trend right now in practical theology, but in other things too, where ethnography, especially, fueling theological work. And again, to the extent history fuels mine, I think it's the same kind of thing, just in different decades. I think a lot of our energy there, in thinking about method, so a lot of the kind of meta energy, the methodological stuff, has gone into learning the methods of, say, ethnography, or learning how to do a historical work. That's right. You have to learn how to do that stuff. But the methodological stuff that I think is underdeveloped, it's under-theorized, and needs a lot more attention, is how you move from the descriptive stuff to any kind of normative or constructive theological claims. That's it. It's committing the naturalist fallacy that moving between is and ought, that moving from talking about observable phenomena in the world to talking about the movement of God in the world. These are different registers of speech. And I think a lot of times we have kind of unreflective shortcuts where we slide between them. Like we go to ethnography of a community and we say this is their theology, but then in the writing, the theology of this group becomes the normative theological position of the book. There's a kind of sleight of hand by which that happened, right? The question I was going to ask is, well, okay, you convinced me that they think this about God, but why is it true about God? I don't know. That would be a further question. So it's only to identify, like for future work in the field, that spot where you move between the normative or descriptive, move between the descriptive and the normative or constructive theological. I think that's where we need to kind of put our methodological energies these days.
Yeah, and I want to kind of build on this a little bit because it's a discussion we've had in this class in the last few weeks, and one that I keep liking to reflect on. The language that shows up to talk about where theology intersects with the descriptive work of people doing practical theology kind of comes back to a term, normativity. And I wonder if normativity is actually the word that really captures what theology is and does, or whether it seems to me so much sometimes when I read practical theology, it feels like a big hammer, and to me theology is much more than simply that. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work is that you're willing to live at that gap between description and theology, and I really respect that in part because I think it's the gap that really gives room to talk about God in ways, and I don't think the term normativity quite captures it for me. I wrestle with that one.
That is worth this whole call to me. I think you are so right, and you've really put your finger on it. It's just great. You're right. I think that normative and the language of normativity is what we oppose to the descriptive, right? Usually, but I think you're right that it's not what we should use. In part because the normative is the language of ethics. It's is versus ought. But theology does not only happen in the key of ethics. It is not
Thanks
only
be to God.
What we're doing is we have a richer account of what is.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So it's is and really is. Maybe is what we've got And it's sort of, it's a classic modernist fallacy to turn or to reduce theological claims to ethical claims.
And a Kantian one too, I guess.
Stand in for that. We just play right into it.
Yeah.
So I think you're exactly right, and that is that feeling I get sometimes. What I agree with you that a lot of practical theology can feel like it's hammering, but to me it feels like ethics.
Yeah.
You know, like in the end, that's like you scratch it, you done it. That's all it is. And I think we want it to be something other and something more. I'm got a paragraph break, but I'm so glad you see that in my work. That makes me really happy. I like this is the one of the ways I try to think about that gap is via Adorno and Benjamin, and part of what that means is absolutely refusing to kind of make the Hegelian move of just smoothing what is into what God's work in the world, right? To insist on the not yet quality.
Yeah.
And that the not yet is just that it hasn't yet fully worked itself out, it's not realizing itself smoothly in history, but a kind of an insistence on an interruption, an insistence on a gap. And to me, that grows out of just taking seriously the level of suffering in the world. But there is no way I could kind of spin that account out in good faith without insisting on the gap. So the way I try to do that, as you probably grabbed right away in the New Measures, is that sixth move of each chapter, the last move of each chapter, is where I try to re-describe it all theologically or eschatologically, right? But there's always a break there between there's a page break or a section break, and there's a little device in the text, and it's meant to not run those things together. And then that final section, that eschatological section, I don't argue for it in the text, right? It's not that all the text culminates in that. It's really just it's almost a prayer. I mean, it's not. It is a prayer. It's a prayer that this is what the world would be like. That this would be a reasonable re-description.
Wow.
So that means not connecting it to those events in such a way that they would demand this interpretation. This would be the only possible interpretation. Right? But leaving that gap there.
I think if it's a prayer, it's also both a prayer of confession and intercession. There's both
that's right.
admitting
And praise.
And a longing
All of,
expressed at the same time.
yeah, and it's an apophatic prayer too. I mean, I think there are those dimensions of it. That it's that's all right.
Well, for me, this is worth the price of admission today, because I think the question is what kind of theologians we'll be. And so I think this is really worth thinking about. Being a practical theologian should be, meaning being a theologian. And I think that's worth getting at. Yes, please.
You mentioned apophatism, and I'm wondering if that question of that moment that you're talking about between the descriptive and the systematic or the theological reflection, if it could, rather than being described in terms of what is, that move to apophatism and describing what isn't, might be a worthwhile way of approaching. So rather than set norms which are norms of what aren't, so to speak. So setting limits of what it isn't rather than what it is. That might be helpful in the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I try to do the moment of negation in this book is really the fifth section of each chapter, and that's where I try to do the strongest statement of what is not, the not yet. And if you think about those different the chapters, that the not is saying it traces the way in which the practice evolved, the way it emerged, kind of what it looked like, how it spread across these different spheres of society. That's the fourth move, how it spread, and then how it even devoured its opponents. It became kind of, even if you're resisting it, you're still doing it. But then the final move of the historical part, and I think you can do this negation in the historical register. The final move is to say it made a promise. It made a promise that it was gospel in some particular way, and then to show how the promise was not kept. So like chapter 3 is about the anxious bench, and the promise of the anxious bench, and the promise really of the 19th century revivals, is that those Calvinists are wrong. The truth is you're free to decide your own eternal destiny. Well, what the anxious bench is, though, is a really coercive ritual to make you become free. And so to see at the root, and this is Foucault, this is Freud, this is Adorno, to see at the root of the kind of freedom that moderns have, a deep, deep binding, a deep lack of freedom and a coerciveness. So what that means is the kind of agency that got unleashed by the revivals promised freedom, but in fact it has coercion and repression at its heart. So that's the negation. And I do think that the negation can happen, you can stay on it can happen in the historical register. That makes sense. So, and that's the apophaticism. Then there's the moment of the no. In an initial version of this, I just ended all of them with the no. But then what I found was, I thought it just was too open to nihilism, and it was too open to, well, just kind of reading like a standard cultural studies thing where you just blow everything up, you know? And that, I think, is itself ideological. So the final moves are not as much like, I'm sure this is the way the world really is. They're in a way placeholders. They're insistence that you need to open up that conversation. And the sixth moves then are not apophatic. They really are the kind of risking of eschatological speech, but it's risking it in order to make sure that space stays open. Because if you cut those off, those final sections off, it really could just kind of collapse down into this ideological criticism, I think. Does that make sense, or?
Yeah. No, it does, and I'm wondering too if that movement to into that eschatological conversation, leaving it open, is also a moment of relation too, not only with the theologian and God, but also the theologian in the community surrounding them as well. And so it's in that relationship that the transformation can happen. In that statement of no, followed by this moment of openness, that transformation can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the way that theology would best be practiced.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the vocation of the theologian or the practical theologian a little bit, because one thing that also intrigues me about this particular work is that it itself sort of migrates across fields. And in a way, it strikes me that this has implications not only for the way homileticians or preachers or practical theologians think, but also historians, people interested in public theology as well. And I'm wondering, a lot of times practical theology talks about the need for there to be sort of a public payoff for what practical theology can be. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own sense of vocation as a theologian in writing a book like The New Measures. What kind of conversations that has sponsored for you, and what kind of engagements it's opened up. The book seems to have a bit of breadth to me that I don't usually see in books in either practical theology or preaching. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your vocation, maybe the public vocation of a theologian or a practical theologian.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question I'm very much in the middle of, right? And I feel like to speak more personally here, I just feel like I'm always negotiating and renegotiating my own vocations. I mean, I still think of my first and primary vocation is as preacher, and not as scholar, not even as scholar of preaching or anything like that, but as preacher. I think that is kind of the taproot of my vocation. And then the way it goes out from there. and that it just has changed across the course of my life in these different ways. But it's always been hybrid for me. You know, at Vanderbilt, ethics was in the front, and I could teach homiletics when I wanted to, but it wasn't really my main appointment. And then here at Candler, I flipped those roles, though the ethics is more, so they're both prominent, but it's always been hybrid. I've been trying to speak to your question about the payoff for practical theology. I am really wary of that kind of talk because I think it plays into what we were just talking about, where theology only really comes alive for us when we turn it into ethics of some kind, or when we turn it into something political, or that's when it starts to seem relevant. I don't think that's right. I think just offering a richer description of the world and of God's saving work with the world, that is a quote-unquote public payoff. There's good to be had there. So I want to resist the talk of turning it into ethics. Any or kind of practical implications, meaning it needs to connect to some political project, though I'm really interested in politics, of course. And I think the other thing I'd want to resist is that it's only valuable if it goes outside the academy. I don't think that. I think there's value to the kind of conversations you can only have in the academy. And I think practical theologians, we should be more comfortable with that. We need more works that do that, but then you always retain that public vocation too. So what this has meant for me, just on the lived stuff of the ground, is this has sparked a lot of conversations with other academics, but it has also sparked several workshops and things that I do with preachers around this, and stuff I talk about with my ministry students here all the time, like the chapter 5 on the authority of authenticity, just tracing the ways that pastoral authority is projected today is a big one. Where I do a workshop on preaching without notes, where I try to both show people how to preach without notes and then try to tell them why people find it so interesting when somebody does preach without notes and why they should be wary of that practice. It's all about contemporary pastoral practice, and it's really a kind of end version of chapter 5.
Could you add a little bit?
So I want to keep that alive. I just don't think every work has to do it every time, right? Mm-hmm. There are works we write that are doing other things, and then there are things we do for other kinds of publics, and you got to keep them all alive.
I wonder if you could.
As far as conversation, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wonder if you could extend this a little bit to the context of the speech that you gave in Virginia, because what strikes me about that moment is you received this invitation to be involved in a wider dialogue.
Yeah.
If you could maybe give us that context a little bit, that might help to root this as well.
Sure. That's the Virginia Project on Lived Theology. I think it's definitely worth checking out their website, and it's Charles Marsh's outfit, and they are not often part of the conversation in political theology, or in public theology, practical theology. Yeah. But what they're doing there in lived theology, to me, this is what great practical theology looks like. So I'm a big fan of their stuff. And it's especially historians and theologians and activists, those three groups getting together and working stuff out. And I think they invited me because they saw my work kind of at the center of those things. And this would be my plea again for not being afraid to do theology, like launch off and do the theology, but also doing whatever descriptive work we do, to do that at the standards of a guild, and then to kind of go beyond it and bring our theological inflection. I think that was part of it too. One of them, this is another kind of on that who do you connect with. I had a really interesting invitation 2 years ago to go to the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University. and we read it. I presented something from this book on John Brown that is coming out soon. And then they read a couple of chapters, maybe even the whole thing of the new measures. Then I talked about it with a bunch of, with a history PhD seminar, or master's and PhD seminar. And it was led by a great historian. And what happened though was we really, at some point, we just kind of hit that this book is not, it just breaks the rules of that guild. You know what I mean? It says things that you're not supposed to say as a historian. And the students, it was a very interesting conversation with them. And finally, one of them, this guy, he just kind of slams the book down on the seminar table, and he points at the history professor and he said, "You said we couldn't do this." I was like, "What?" He's like, "Well, you said when we tell history of religion, you have to tell a history of the religion, but you're not supposed to do the theology, you have to tell the history." And then he said, "But he does it." And then he said, "And you invited him here, so he can't be all bad." But it was this really interesting conversation that was kind of getting real about the tensions between these different ways of doing the work.
It also sounds like a mortified promise. So.
Really clarified for me. I do not want to be a historian. That's not what I want to do. I do this.
Sure.
So, yes, it does create interesting conversation partners of different kinds.
Any further questions? Well, Ted, this has been rich. I'm very grateful you've taken time for us today. I really enjoyed conversing about your book and helping us to think about what we're doing here as well. So let me just express my gratitude for what you're doing and say thank you.
Well, thanks to you, David, for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for listening over the wires, but also for the reading you've done. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.